So we'll continue on talking about communities. In this particular video, we're going to talk about how communities change over time. The idea that a community wouldn't change at all is fairly silly if you think about it, but there could be an example of a community that changes very little over time, and we would say that this community is stable or at equilibrium. Now, most of us understand that a community doesn't stay at equilibrium. There are things that are introduced into those communities that change that kind of equilibrium. If you think about the boom bust cycle of those lynxes and rabbits, just regularly following that general pattern of death and growth and that kind of thing, that would be an example of equilibrium. Even though there is change, it's that change is unchanged. If you get the idea, there's nothing entering into it. What in reality, the world follows a much different pattern, and that is this idea of disturbance ecology. And disturbance ecology is just the study of the different disturbances that can cause an ecosystem to be out of equilibrium or to constantly change. These kinds of disturbances can change the composition of an ecosystem over time. This is a picture of this particular species of starfish that was introduced, and once they were introduced, it completely changed the biodiversity in that ecosystem. This could be something as simple as a fire or a flood, and so it doesn't necessarily have to be a man-caused thing. It could even be a beaver dam. A beaver builds a dam over a stream in the middle of a forest, and half the forest floods. Some animals are going to be really thrilled about the new swimming pool. If you live under the swimming pool, you're probably not very thrilled about it, but it does create a habitat for the beaver. And so you could look at this as a positive or negative thing, but in general, we need to see it as a neutral kind of change. There's no ethical concerns attached to the beaver building its house or this lightning striking a prairie. Of course, this is a controlled burn, but you get the idea. Of fire catching a prairie on fire, or lightning catching a prairie on fire, is a natural occurrence. A tornado destroying a forest is a natural kind of occurrence. Will there be change in that forest as a result? Yes. All the little plants under the canopy that hadn't seen light, much light at all, are now going to thrive. And all of those dead trees are going to return to the ecosystem, take their nutrients back, and replenish the soil. So you get the idea. This is constantly happening in ecosystems, and ecosystems change and adapt accordingly based on those disturbances. There's a general pattern that can be seen. Now, again, this pattern might even suggest somewhat of an equilibrium, that these stages of succession would be very plain and regular. In reality, they're changing as well. But there is a general pattern that can be understood throughout these kinds of changes. And there's two patterns of succession that we're going to talk about. And succession is just a change of an ecosystem over time. And so if you have Mount St. Helens, for instance, was a mountain in 1980, it erupted and completely decimated the countryside. There's half of a mountain blows off, and now the countryside is covered in rock and ash and liquid hot magma. And so it's going to take things a while to grow back, and that's exactly what you see. In this kind of situation, when you're starting over at rock, you have what's called primary succession. Think of Hawaii coming out from the depths of the Pacific Ocean over millions of years and finally showing its face. This is an example of primary succession, that you have this rock that nothing can grow on except for a few things. These are called pioneer species. There are a couple things that we think of that can grow on rock. Typically, you will see listed things like moss and lichens. These are two types of organisms that grow. Moss is a real primitive plant. Lichen is a fungus algae mixture thing. and they can grow on rocks because they don't need roots, and they can break down the rock over time and get nutrients, and will decompose themselves and begin to break down the rock, and then with their decomposing bodies also form a shallow layer of soil, which you would expect there to be grass growing on after a while. And I mean, the seeds have to get there and so forth. You get the idea. But those seeds will grow, the grass will grow, decompose, add to the soil. The soil will create more and more depth, and eventually you get bigger things like shrubs and small trees, trees that have a very shallow root base like pine trees. And then lastly, you will have bigger trees, hardwood trees, and this is where you have like a climax community. Climax community is the last community to move into an area, usually a hardwood forest, but depending on the part of the world you're in, it may not be that. And like a taiga or some boreal forests, the pine trees are the end game for those types of forests because they do better in colder climates. And so this is Hawaii today, after the volcanic types of things. This is a climax community. Nothing's going to be added to this. However, could something wipe that out and it have to start over? Absolutely. Now, is it going to start over at rock? No, because those trees are planted in soil, so it's going to start over at soil. This is called secondary succession. Secondary succession is when you start over at soil. Could be after a forest fire, could be after the farmer tills up the ground. There's lots of things that could cause this secondary succession, but it follows the same basic pattern, except for it just starts at soil rather than rock. So there's secondary succession again. After forest fire, you have lots of pretty flowers. So let's talk about these two terms. Species richness we've talked about. This is the number of different species. Relative abundance is a term that has to do with one species compared to another. Both of these pictures, for instance, have the same richness. Both pictures, Community 1 and Community 2, have 4 different species. However, in Community 2, species A is in much greater relative abundance than the other one. So the species B and C are relatively rare. And so these are types of terms that we will use when we're talking about abundance, versus richness is just counting the actual numbers of different species that are there. In general, the larger a land area, the more species rich you would expect it to be, which makes sense because large land areas, lots of habitat, lots of niches, means lots of species. And this rule generally proves true. Here's a couple other graphs that show that same kind of idea. Vertebrates, trees, same kind of thing. Also, what you'd expect to see is as you move closer to the equator, you're going to have a more species richness as well. So because there's more energy as you move further away from the equator, less energy, less richness. Now, islands generally follow this same kind of idea. A couple other things with islands. Bigger islands, more richness, yes. The further away that an island is from the mainland, the less like its mainland it will be. So there will be more variation, perhaps more biodiversity than what was on the mainland. And another interesting thing that happens on islands as well is the smaller an island is, the smaller the species that live on that island may be. Pygmy elephants living on Indonesian islands are a great example of this. The last population of woolly mammoths to go extinct were on a small island, and that was a generally smaller population of mammoths than were found in other parts of the world because of this uh, phenomena of pygmism.